Lovecraftian horror is a subgenre of horror fiction that emphasizes the cosmic horror of the unknown more than gore or other elements of shock, though these may still be present. It is named after American author H.P. Lovecraft. Origin: Lovecraft refined the style of storytelling into his own mythos that involved a set of supernatural, pre-human, and extraterrestrial elements. His work was inspired by and similar to previous authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Algernon Blackwood, and Lord Dunsany. The hallmark of Lovecraft's work is cosmicism, the sense that ordinary life is a thin shell over a reality that is so alien and abstract in comparison that merely contemplating it would damage the sanity of the ordinary person. Lovecraft's work is also steeped in the insular feel of rural New England, and much of the genre continues to maintain this sense that which man was not meant to know might be closer to the surface of ordinary life, outside of the crowded cities of modern civilization. However, Lovecraftian horror is not restricted to the countryside. The horror at Red Hook, for instance, is set in a crowded ethnic ghetto. Themes of Lovecraftian horror: several themes found in Lovecraft's writings are considered to be components of a Lovecraftian work: anti-anthropocentrism, misanthropy in general. Lovecraft's works tend not to focus on characterization of humans, in line with his view of humanity's insignificant place in the universe, and the general modernist trend of literature at the time of his writings. Preoccupation with viscerate texture. The horror features of Lovecraft stories tend to involve protean semi-gelatinous substances, such as slime, as opposed to standard horror elements such as blood, bones, or corpses. Antiquarian writing style. Even when dealing with up-to-date technology, Lovecraft tended to use anachronisms as well as old-fashioned words when dealing with such things. For example, he used the term man of science rather than the modern word scientist, and often spelled show as show and lantern as lanthorn. Detachment. Lovecraftian heroes tend to be isolated individuals, usually with an academic or scholarly intent. Helplessness and hopelessness. Although Lovecraftian heroes may occasionally deal a setback to malignant forces, the victories are temporary, and they usually pay a price for it. Otherwise, subjects often find themselves completely unable to simply run away, instead driven by some other force to the desperate end. Unanswered questions. Characters in Lovecraft stories rarely if ever fully understand what is happening to them, and often go insane if they try. Sanity's fragility and vulnerability. Characters in many of Lovecraft's stories are unable to cope mentally with the extraordinary and almost incomprehensible truths they witness or hear. The strain of trying to cope, as Lovecraft often illustrates, is impossible to bear, and insanity takes hold. Questionable parentage. Relatives of characters are typically depicted as paranormal or abnormal, whereas intimate relations in general are often represented as foreboding and sinister. Collaborators and followers. Much of Lovecraft's influence is secondary, as he was a friend, inspiration, and correspondent to many authors who would gain fame through the creations. Many of these writers also worked with Lovecraft on jointly written stories. His more famous friends and collaborators include Robert Bloch, author of Psycho, Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, and August Derleth, who codified and added to the Cthulhu mythos. Subsequent horror writers also heavily drew on Lovecraft's work, while many made direct references to elements of Lovecraft's mythos, either to draw on its associations or to acknowledge his influence. Many others drew on the feel and tone of his work without specifically referring to mythos elements. Some have said that Lovecraft, along with Edgar Allan Poe, is the most influential author on modern horror. Author Stephen King has said, "Now that time has given us some perspective on his work, I think it is beyond doubt that H.P. Lovecraft has yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale." By the late 20th century, Lovecraft had become something of a pop culture icon, resulting in countless reinterpretations of and references to his work. Many of these fall outside the sphere of Lovecraftian horror, but represent Cthulhu mythos in popular culture, literature and art. Lovecraft's work, mostly published in pulp magazines, never had the same sort of influence on literature as his high modernist literary contemporaries such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. However, his impact is still broadly and deeply felt in some of the most celebrated authors of contemporary fiction. The fantasias of George Louis Borges display a marked resemblance to some of Lovecraft's more dream-influenced work. Borges also dedicated his story, There Are More Things, to Lovecraft, though he also considered Lovecraft an involuntary parodist of Poe. The controversial French novelist Michel Houellebecq has also cited Lovecraft as an influence and has written a lengthy essay on Lovecraft, entitled H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, in which he refers to the Cthulhu cycle as the Great Texts. Lovecraft's penchant for dreamscapes and for the biologically macabre has also profoundly influenced visual artists such as Jean Mobius Giraud and H.R. Giger. Giger's book of paintings, which led directly to many of the designs for the film Alien, was named Necronomicon, the name of a fictional book in several of Lovecraft's mythos stories. Dan O'Bannon, the original writer of the Alien screenplay, has also mentioned Lovecraft as a major influence on the film. With Ronald Shusett, he would later write Dead and Amp, Buried and Hemoglobin, both of which were admitted pastiches of Lovecraft. Comics. Lovecraft has cast a long shadow across the comic world. This has included not only adaptations of his stories, such as H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu's The Whisperer in Darkness, graphic classics, H.P. Lovecraft and Max's Haunt of Horror, but also the incorporation of the mythos into new stories. Alan Moore has touched on Lovecraftian themes, most obviously in his The Courtyard and Yuggoth Cultures and Other Growths, but also in his Black Dossier, where the story, What Ho! Gods of the Abyss, mixed Lovecraftian horror with Bertie Wooster. Neonomicon and Providence posit a world where the mythos, while existing as fiction written by Lovecraft, is also very real. Gordon Rennie not only used various Lovecraft creations, like TCHO in his Necronauts, but he also included Lovecraft himself as a character, teaming up with an influence of his Charles Fort, a combination that would occur again in Fort, Prophet of the Unexplained. Necronauts wasn't the first appearance of Lovecraftian horror in 2000 AD, as Grant Morrison's Zenith involved the eponymous hero trying to stop the gore, known as the Many-Angled Ones. Entities also called Many-Angled Ones appear in the Marvel Universe in the storyline Realm of Kings, where they rule an alternate reality. This storyline was in the Guardians of the Galaxy comic, where an alternate universe invades the main Marvel Universe. The invading universe, dubbed the Cancerverse in the comics, is a universe where Lovecraft's elder gods triumph over death and conquer the universe. The inspiration for the universe is clearly Lovecraftian, as even the words are taken directly from Lovecraft's writings. The most obvious example of this is the word FHTAGN, as the story involves a space setting, fighting alien gods. The only noteworthy bar between it and a true tale of Lovecraftian horror is that the forces of good triumph. This is achieved only by releasing a galactic mass murderer loose on both universes, providing some lasting horror. The Marvel Universe also contains a range of Cthulhu mythos comics, including The Elder Gods, as well as appearing with 14 comic stories. Lovecraft has appeared as a character in a number of Lovecraftian comics. He appears in MacArthur's and Tony Salmons' limited series The Strange Adventures of H.P. Lovecraft from Image, and in the Arcana children's graphic novel Howard and the Frozen Kingdom from Bruce Brown. A webcomic, Lovecraft Is Missing, debuted in 2008 and takes place in 1926, before the publication of The Call of Cthulhu, and weaves in elements of Lovecraft's earlier stories. Boom Studios have also run a number of series based on Cthulhu and other characters from the mythos, including Cthulhu Tales and Fall of Cthulhu. A creator of Hellboy, Mike Mignola, has described the books as being influenced primarily by the works of Lovecraft, in addition to those of Robert E. Howard and The Legend of Dracula. This was adapted into the 2004 film Hellboy. His Elseworlds miniseries The Doom That Came to Gotham reimagines Batman in a confrontation with Lovecraftian monsters. The manga artist Junji Ito was heavily influenced by Lovecraft. The third volume of the comic series Atomic Robo, named Atomic Robo and the Shadow from Beyond Time, features a Lovecraftian monster as the antagonist, and indeed has an appearance from H.P. Lovecraft himself. Issue number 32 of The Brave and the Bold was heavily influenced by the works and style of Lovecraft, in addition to using pastiches of Cthulhu's The Deep Ones, and RLYH writer J. Michael Straczynski also read the story in a distinctly Lovecraftian style, written entirely from the perspective of a traumatized sailor. The story makes use of several of Lovecraft's trademarks, including the ultimate feeling of insignificance in the face of the supernatural. The Illustrated Ape magazine features a Lovecraft-related webcomic on its site in the Galleries section. The strip is written and illustrated by Charles Cutting and uses the dream quest of Unknown Kadath as its basis. The webcomic Homestuck utilizes concepts from Lovecraftian horror, namely with the horror terrors, beings reminiscent of the monsters of the Cthulhu mythos. These creatures are largely unknown to the main characters, aside from Rose, who transforms into a grimdark state after questioning the morality, speaking in odd glyphs and sporting a tentacle aura. The most noticeable relations of the size, the names, and the dark, mysterious nature, residing in a region of deep space unaffected by the passing of time and speaking prophecies and warnings to the residents of Durst, film and television. For the 1950s onwards, in the era following Lovecraft's death, Lovecraftian horror truly became a subgenre, not only fueling direct cinematic adaptations of Poe and Lovecraft, but providing the foundation upon which many of the horror films of the 1950s and 1960s were constructed. For instance, Kaltiki, the immortal monster, has been considered Lovecraftian in subject matter and approach. 1960s. One notable filmmaker to dip into the Lovecraftian well was 1960s B-filmmaker Roger Corman, with his The Haunted Palace being very loosely based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward, and his X featuring a protagonist driven to insanity by heightened vision that allows him to see God at the heart of the universe. Though not direct adaptations, the episodes of the well-known series The Outer Limits often had Lovecraftian themes, such as human futility and insignificance and the limits of sanity and understanding. Amongst the other well-known adaptations of this era are Dark Intruder, which has some passing references to the Cthulhu mythos, The Shuttered Room, based on an August Derleth posthumous collaboration with Lovecraft, whose plot was closely based on Lovecraft's The Dunnage Horror and Curse of the Crimson Altar, based on The Dreams in the Witch House, 1970s. The Dunnage Horror was based directly on Lovecraft's story of the same name, though with such plot diversions as introducing a female love interest for the character of Wilbur Whately. Rod Serling's 1969-73 series Night Gallery adapted at least 2 Lovecraft stories, Pickman's Model and Cool Air. The episode, Professor Peabody's Last Lecture Concerning the Fate of a Man Who Read the Necronomicon, included a student named Mr. Lovecraft, along with other students sharing names of authors in the Lovecraft Circle. Dan O'Bannon and Ridley Scott's 1979 Alien bore a strong Lovecraftian influence, especially in the set design of H.R. Giger, who has published 2 art books inspired by Lovecraft's fictional Necronomicon. O'Bannon later made The Resurrected based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward. 1980s. As the 1980s and 1990s played out, Lovecraftian horror became a recognizable film staple in a variety of films. In 1981, the Evil Dead comedy horror film franchise was created by Sam Raimi after studying H.P. Lovecraft. It consists of the films The Evil Dead 2, and Army of Darkness. The Necronomicon Ex Mortis, or simply the Book of the Dead, is depicted in each of the 3 films. John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy feature Lovecraftian elements which becomes more noticeable in each film. The 1984 blockbuster Ghostbusters is noticeably reminiscent of Lovecraft's style. 3 episodes of the animated spin-off series are directly inspired by the Cthulhu mythos. The blackly comedic Reanimator was based on Lovecraft's serial Herbert West. Reanimator spawned numerous sequel films. 1986's From Beyond was loosely based on Lovecraft's story of the same title, From Beyond. 1987's film The Curse was an effective adaptation of Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space. However, its sequel, Curse 2, The Bite, had no Lovecraftian relevance. 1988's The Unnameable was a loose adaptation of Lovecraft's story of the same title, The Unnameable. 1990s. The 1991 HBO film Cast a Deadly Spell starred Fred Ward as Harry Philip Lovecraft, a noir detective investigating the theft of the Necronomicon in an alternate universe 1948 Los Angeles where magic was commonplace. The sequel, Witch Hunt, had Dennis Hopper as H. Philip Lovecraft in a story set 2 years later. 1992's The Resurrected, directed by Dan O'Bannon, is an adaptation of Lovecraft's novel The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. It contains numerous elements faithful to Lovecraft's story, though the studio made major cuts to the film. 1993's The Unnameable Returns, aka Unnameable 2. The Statement of Randolph Carter was a sequel to 1988's The Unnameable, loosely based on Lovecraft's story The Statement of Randolph Carter. The self-referential Necronomicon featured Lovecraft himself as a character, played by Jeffrey Combs. The 3 stories in Necronomicon are based on 3 H.P. Lovecraft short stories. The Drowned is based on The Rats in the Walls, The Cold is based on Cool Air, and Whispers is based on The Whisperer in Darkness. 1994's The Lurking Fear is an adaptation of Lovecraft's story, The Lurking Fear. It has some elements faithful to Lovecraft's story, while being hijacked by a crime caper subplot. 1995's Castle Freak is loosely inspired by Lovecraft's story, The Outsider. 1995's In the Mouth of Madness contains plot elements elements and settings, themes reminiscent of Lovecraft's writings. The television series Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its 1999 spin-off Angel have essentially a Lovecraftian background setting, in which the world was once ruled by the demonic Old Ones before being forced into another dimension by a revolution where they wait to return one day. 2001's Dagon is a Spanish-made horror film directed by Stuart Gordon. Though titled after Lovecraft's story, Dagon, the film is actually an effective adaptation of his The Shadow over Innsmouth. The 2003 Italian-made feature The Shunned House, directed by Ivan Zuccon, is loosely based on Lovecraft's story of the same title, The Shunned House. 2005's The Call of Cthulhu, made by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, is a largely successful cinematic version of Lovecraft's story, using silent film techniques to mimic the feel of a film that might have been made at the time Lovecraft's story was written. 2005's The Dreams in the Witch House was a faithful adaptation of Lovecraft's story, The Dreams in the Witch House, directed by Stuart Gordon, as an episode of the TV series Masters of Horror. 2007's The Tomb, directed by Ulli Lommel, though it uses Lovecraft's name on the credits and DVD packaging, is entirely unrelated to any work by Lovecraft including his story, The Tomb. 2007's The Mist, directed by Frank Darabont, is based on a Stephen King short story. Although it does not make any explicit reference to H.P. Lovecraft's work, the film features several Lovecraftian themes and creatures. 2008's sci-fi film The Dunnage Horror features Jeffrey Combs and Dean Stockwell. The action is transplanted from Lovecraft's New England town Dunnage to a town in Louisiana. 2009's The Last Lovecraft, Relic of Cthulhu, plays Lovecraftian themes for laughs. Lovecraft's last relative must help save the world from Cthulhu's return. 2010's Lovecraftian elements can also be seen in the Swedish horror film Marianne, where the helpless teacher Krista is unsure whether he is being haunted, or if he is going mad. The Swedish horror writers John Ajvide Lindqvist and Anders Fager have both written their own installments in the Cthulhu mythos. The 2010 film Die Farbe is based on the short story The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft. One notable difference from the original short story is that it takes place in Germany instead of in Massachusetts. It is shot mainly in black and white, the exception being the color itself. In the Coon and Friends trilogy of the animated show South Park, Cthulhu's cultists and Lovecraftian elements of hopelessness, confusion, and the paranormal are major plot elements, and often parodied throughout the 3 episodes. The 2011 film The Whisperer in Darkness is based on an H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name. It was produced by Andrew Lemon, who directed The Call of Cthulhu in 2001. It was shot in black and white like The Call of Cthulhu, but it is not a silent film. The Swedish director Mans Marlin's next project is a screen version of Anders Fager's book Collected Swedish Cults, an anthology about ancient beings and the Swedish cults dedicated to them. Drew Goddard directed the 2012 film The Cabin in the Woods. The film, scripted by Goddard and Joss Whedon, features an organization known as the Facility that sacrifices 5 young people in the theme of a horror film, in order to placate the Ancient Ones, who once dominated the earth and now live below, so that they will not rise again. 2013's Evil Dead, directed by Fede Alvarez, has the Necronomicon play a key role in the plot just as the original The Evil Dead did. 2013's Hayao Naruko-san and anime series, is about the human descendants of several of the Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos deities being directly mentioned as main characters, such as the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, Naruko, the living flame Kuko, and the wind deity Hasuta, along with other incantations and references to Lovecraft's works. Sleepy Hollow, Season 2, Episode 2 uses an incantation for a magic spell drawn from Lovecraft.